When medieval writers tried to explain the Mongols, they often began not with tactics, but with terror. Long before walls were breached or armies assembled, word of their approach traveled across deserts, rivers, and mountain passes. Merchants whispered of entire garrisons erased. Refugees spoke of rulers who had fled rather than faced them. By the time Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, something inside a city had already shifted. Confidence had weakened. Doubt had taken root. In 1206, when Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan on the Mongolian steppe, he did not inherit ancient capitals or stone fortresses. He commanded horsemen hardened by wind and hunger, and he possessed an understanding that would redefine conquest. The Mongols did not rely solely on brute force. They relied on perception. They cultivated a reputation so precise and so consistent that resistance began to feel irrational. Their greatest weapon was invisible. It moved ahead of their cavalry, crossed borders without resistance, and unsettled defenders before the first arrow was loosed. Cities were not always destroyed by prolonged siege or brutal assault. Often, they were undone by the belief that resistance would only make the outcome worse. Fear alone does not conquer cities. It must be backed by a system capable of delivering on its threats. In 1206, after uniting the tribes of the Mongolian steppe, Genghis Khan began constructing that system with ruthless clarity. For generations, steppe society had been divided by clan loyalties and fragile alliances. Authority rested on bloodlines and personal reputation. Genghis Khan dismantled that structure and replaced it with disciplined organization. He reorganized his followers into a decimal hierarchy, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These divisions were practical instruments of control, not symbolic titles. Warriors from different tribes were deliberately mixed within the same units, weakening old loyalties and binding them to a central command. Promotion depended on merit and reliability rather than noble birth. A capable soldier could rise through the ranks if he proved disciplined and effective. This meritocracy created fierce loyalty and ensured that commanders were experienced rather than merely privileged. Discipline was enforced through collective responsibility. If one soldier deserted or disobeyed orders, his entire unit could face punishment. This system eliminated hesitation and reinforced cohesion under pressure. Each man understood that his actions affected not only himself, but his comrades. Communication further strengthened this machine. Mounted couriers carried orders across vast distances, while flags, horns, and drums signaled commands in battle. Units separated by miles could move in coordination, appearing to enemies as unpredictable swarms when they were, in fact, carefully synchronized detachments. Mobility amplified this advantage. Every Mongol warrior was a skilled rider, often traveling with multiple horses to maintain speed over long distances. They could appear where least expected, strike swiftly, and vanish before defenders reorganized. This structure made Mongol threats credible. When a city was warned to surrender, its leaders knew they faced an army that functioned with precision and unity. The discipline of the Mongol system ensured that promises of destruction were not empty. Fear became effective because it was supported by organization. The invisible weapon depended on this foundation. Without structure, terror would have been dismissed as rumor. With it, reputation became reality, and resistance began to seem like a gamble few were willing to take. Discipline made the Mongol army formidable, but intelligence made it efficient. Before their forces crossed borders, information had already been gathered. Scouts rode ahead of the main columns, studying river crossings, mountain passes, road networks, and the condition of city walls. They measured distances between settlements and noted which rulers were unpopular or divided. Campaigns were rarely blind invasions. They were informed operations shaped by reconnaissance. Trade networks provided another layer of awareness. Merchants traveling along the Silk Road carried more than silk and spices, they carried news. Mongol leaders understood the value of this flow of information. Diplomatic envoys and commercial caravans observed fortifications, counted soldiers, and listened for rumors of internal rivalries. Even hostile responses yielded insight. In 1218, when a Mongol trade caravan was seized at Otra in the Khwarezmian Empire and its members executed, the incident exposed both defiance and overconfidence within the court of Shah Muhammad II. It revealed a ruler who underestimated the consequences of his actions. When Genghis Khan launched his invasion of Khwarezm in 1219, he did not advance in a single overwhelming mass. Instead, Mongol forces split into multiple columns, crossing deserts and mountains from different directions. Cities expecting a traditional frontal assault found themselves attacked simultaneously from unexpected approaches. This strategy disrupted communication between defenders and shattered assumptions about where the main threat would fall. The sense of being surrounded before a siege even began intensified fear inside city walls. Intelligence also shaped battlefield tactics. Mongol commanders studied how heavily armored cavalry favored decisive charges and how feudal coalitions often struggled with unified command. Knowing this, they crafted maneuvers that encouraged overconfidence and disorganization. Their famous feigned retreats relied on predicting how opponents would react under pressure. By gathering information first and striking second, the Mongols reduced the need for prolonged combat. Knowledge narrowed uncertainty and amplified confidence within their own ranks. For defenders, the opposite occurred. Confusion grew as plans unraveled and familiar expectations failed. The invisible weapon was not simply terror, but preparation. By understanding their enemies in advance, the Mongols ensured that when confrontation came, it unfolded on terms already shaped in their favor. Information and discipline gave the Mongols control, but it was consistency that transformed their conquests into something far more efficient. As their campaigns expanded beyond the steppe, they established a clear and deliberate pattern: surrender would bring survival, resistance would bring devastation. This was not random cruelty. It was a calculated formula designed to influence decisions before battle began. During the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire between 1219 and 1221, that formula became unmistakable. When cities such as Bokhara resisted, Mongol forces responded with overwhelming force. Siege engines breached walls, defenders were defeated decisively, and the consequences were visible enough to serve as a warning. Samarkand, one of the region's great centers, suffered a similar fate after resistance collapsed. Yet the Mongols did not treat every city identically. When towns opened their gates quickly and pledged loyalty, destruction was often limited. Skilled artisans, engineers, and administrators were spared and absorbed into the expanding empire. The message was simple and brutally rational: submission preserved life and stability, defiance invited ruin. Survivors from devastated cities sometimes escaped along trade routes, carrying first-hand accounts of what they had witnessed. These stories spread through markets and court chambers across Central Asia and beyond. Whether numbers were exaggerated mattered less than the pattern that emerged. Rulers learned that Mongol threats were not idle. The consequences of resistance had been demonstrated repeatedly and publicly. This consistency reduced the need for prolonged sieges. Fear began to do much of the work. As Mongol columns approached new territories, governors faced a choice already defined by precedent. To resist was to risk annihilation. To surrender was to preserve their population and often retain a degree of local authority under Mongol oversight. Increasingly, gates opened before catapults were assembled. The Mongols had discovered that destruction, when applied selectively and predictably, could multiply its own effect. Cities were not always destroyed through drawn-out combat. Many were undone by calculation. The invisible weapon lay not only in terror, but in the credibility of their promises. By proving that they would carry out their threats without hesitation, the Mongols ensured that fewer battles were necessary. Resistance declined not because walls had grown weaker, but because belief in those walls had. If consistency made Mongol threats believable, battlefield deception made them unforgettable. Even when open combat was unavoidable, Mongol commanders sought to end engagements quickly by manipulating expectation. Their most infamous tactic, the feigned retreat, turned the instincts of their enemies against them. At first, the maneuver seemed straightforward. Mongol cavalry would advance, release volleys of arrows to disrupt formations, and then abruptly turn and withdraw. To opponents trained in traditions of decisive charges, retreat signaled weakness. The urge to pursue felt natural, even necessary. But the withdrawal was rarely a collapse. Mongol riders maintained spacing and cohesion even while retreating at speed. They fired backward with precision from their composite bows, harassing pursuers and stretching formations thinner with every moment. As heavily armored cavalry surged forward, infantry struggled to keep pace. Communication faltered in the dust and confusion. Units became separated from their commanders. What had been a unified line fractured into isolated groups. The Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223 demonstrated how devastating this approach could be. Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe faced a coalition of Rus princes and their Kuman allies. After initial clashes, the Mongols withdrew deliberately, drawing the coalition into a pursuit that lasted several days. Convinced that victory was within reach, the Rus forces advanced across unfamiliar terrain, growing fatigued and disorganized. When the Mongols finally turned to engage decisively, they did so on ground they had chosen carefully. Hidden reserves struck from the flanks, sealing the trap. Leaders were targeted first, accelerating panic. The coalition collapsed into scattered resistance and was destroyed. Such maneuvers required extraordinary discipline. A retreat risks becoming genuine if morale falters, yet Mongol units trusted their structure and timing. Their enemies, driven by pride and the desire for swift triumph, often undermined their own cohesion. The result was not merely tactical defeat, but psychological shock. News of sudden reversals and encirclements spread quickly, reinforcing the image of an enemy impossible to predict. Each battlefield victory strengthened the invisible weapon. Fear deepened because defeat seemed to arrive without warning. By exploiting expectation, the Mongols ensured that future cities and armies would hesitate before challenging them, reducing the need for prolonged fighting. By 1241, the Mongol advance had reached the edges of Europe, and the reputation forged in Central Asia began to test Western confidence. For years, reports of shattered principalities and fleeing rulers had traveled westward, but distance bred skepticism. Many believed the devastation exaggerated or confined to lands far beyond their borders. That illusion ended in April. On April 9, 1241, near Legnica in Poland, a coalition of European forces gathered to halt the Mongol army under Batik Khan and the seasoned general Subutai. Silesian knights and contingents from the Teutonic Order stood ready, armored and disciplined in the traditions of shock cavalry that had defined European warfare for generations. The encounter did not unfold as expected. Mongol horse archers engaged briefly, loosing arrows before appearing to withdraw. As at Khalkha, pursuit followed. Knights surged forward, formations stretching as speed overtook coordination. Smoke and dust obscured visibility, adding to confusion. At a chosen moment, Mongol units pivoted and counterattacked. Arrows struck commanders first, unraveling the chain of command. Units that had advanced too far found themselves isolated. What had begun as a confident charge dissolved into fragmented resistance. 2 days later, on April 11, a larger confrontation unfolded at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary. King Bela IV positioned his forces near the Sejo River, believing the waterway and fortified camp would restrict Mongol maneuver. The Mongols initiated a frontal assault at the main bridge, fixing Hungarian attention. Under cover of darkness, another force constructed a crossing downstream. When battle resumed, Hungarian troops faced attack from multiple directions. Feigned retreats drew segments into exposed terrain while encirclement tightened around the camp. Heavy armor, once an advantage in close combat, became a burden in mud and chaos. The psychological consequences spread quickly across Europe. Survivors carried stories of sudden reversals and disciplined maneuvering to courts already uneasy. Fortifications no longer seemed sufficient. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. Even where fighting remained intense, the pattern was clear: Mongol armies rarely needed prolonged engagements to secure victory. Reputation, reinforced by swift and decisive tactics, weakened resistance before the next confrontation began. Europe learned that the true danger lay not only in the clash of steel, but in the collapse of certainty that preceded it. By the mid-13th century, Mongol power extended deep into the Middle East, and their reputation had already reshaped the political calculations of countless rulers. Yet the campaign that culminated in 1258 would demonstrate how symbolic destruction could eliminate resistance across an entire region. Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, advanced toward Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. For centuries, Baghdad had stood as a center of political authority, scholarship, and wealth in the Islamic world. Its prestige seemed inseparable from its survival. Many believed that history itself offered protection. The Mongols treated it as another objective. Hulagu's approach followed the established pattern. Mongol forces encircled the city, severing supply routes and preventing escape. Siege engines, refined through earlier campaigns in China and Central Asia, were assembled with methodical precision. Artillery battered the walls while cavalry sealed the perimeter. The assault was disciplined and coordinated, not chaotic. Within weeks, the defenses failed. The fall of Baghdad carried consequences far beyond military defeat. Contemporary accounts describe immense destruction and loss of life, though figures vary widely. What remains undeniable is the psychological shock. The Abbasid Caliph, long regarded as a symbol of enduring authority, proved unable to defend his capital. Institutions associated with centuries of intellectual and cultural achievement were devastated, reinforcing the sense that an era had ended. Whether every chronicle detail was exact mattered less than the impact of the event across the wider world. The message was unmistakable. If Baghdad could fall, no city could rely on prestige, faith, or history for protection. The submit or die precedent that had defined earlier campaigns was now reinforced at the highest symbolic level. Rulers across the Middle East recalculated their options. Resistance risked annihilation, submission offered incorporation into the Mongol system. In many regions, the decision became pragmatic rather than defiant. Mongol forces did not need to storm every fortress to assert dominance. The example of Baghdad served as a warning powerful enough to reduce opposition elsewhere. Symbol over steel, reputation over prolonged combat, the invisible weapon reached its apex. By destroying a capital whose authority once seemed unshakable, the Mongols ensured that fewer battles would be necessary in its shadow. In the end, the Mongols demonstrated that cities could be destroyed without constant fighting because fear itself could dismantle resistance. Their campaigns were not effortless, nor were they free of brutal combat, but they were shaped by calculation. Discipline made their threats credible. Intelligence made their movements unpredictable. Consistency made their punishments believable. Over time, rulers facing Mongol advance often chose surrender before siege engines were assembled. Gates opened because precedent had removed uncertainty. Resistance felt less like courage and more like self-destruction. Yet this invisible weapon depended on momentum and unity. After the deaths of powerful khans and the fragmentation of the empire into separate khanates, the aura of inevitability began to fade. Expansion slowed as rivals adapted and Mongol authority divided. The pattern that had once opened cities with minimal fighting required constant reinforcement. What endured was the lesson. The Mongols did not simply conquer through strength of arms. They conquered through the manipulation of expectation. By convincing their enemies that defeat was unavoidable, they reduced the need to prove it again and again on the battlefield.